What if the oldest stories we possess do not begin at the beginning, but after something has already ended? What if the clay tablets of ancient Mesopotamia are not records of origins, but fragments salvaged from a silence that followed panic? There is a peculiar stillness in the earliest lines of Sumerian text, as though the scribes were writing in the shadow of something unspeakable, a departure, a rupture, a memory too heavy to carry intact. So before you allow your body to sink fully into this quiet space, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly feel drawn to these journeys into forgotten time, and if you wish, share your location and local time in the comments. It is always humbling to see how far these whispers travel through the night. The first cities of southern Mesopotamia rose from marshland and river silt, from the slow breathing of the Tigris and Euphrates. Uruk, Eridu, Nippur, their names still echo through museum halls and university lectures, carried by clay tablets hardened under a sun that no longer shines on those same waters. In these tablets, pressed with reed styluses into damp earth, we encounter the Anunnaki, a council of divine beings who measured destinies and assigned kingship. Yet something feels incomplete. The Sumerian King List, preserved in several copies from different periods, opens with a striking statement: kingship descended from heaven. It then lists rulers who reigned not for decades, but for tens of thousands of years. Alulim of Eridu is said to have ruled for 28,800 years, Al-Algar for 36,000. The numbers stretch across spans that defy biological possibility. Then, abruptly, the text marks a break. Then the flood swept over. After that, the rains shorten, the lifespans contract, the world becomes familiar. Why does history narrow so suddenly? Scholars have long interpreted these exaggerated reigns symbolically, perhaps reflecting a mythic time when divine order structured the cosmos. Others suggest mathematical conventions based on the Sumerian sexagesimal system may have inflated these figures beyond literal meaning. But even within symbolic language, transitions matter. The King List does not simply move from myth to history. It announces catastrophe, a sweeping interruption, and it is not alone. The Atrahasis epic, written in Akkadian but rooted in older Sumerian traditions, describes a time when the gods grew weary of labour and fashioned humans to bear the burden. Later, disturbed by the noise of humanity, the gods resolved to send plague, famine, and finally a great flood. Only through warning does one man survive. After the waters recede, sacrifices are offered, and the divine assembly gathers, hungry and regretful. Something in the tone shifts from authority to unease. Is this merely moral storytelling, or the echo of a memory reshaped through generations? In these accounts, the Anunnaki are not distant abstractions. They deliberate, they disagree, they fear, and in certain passages they withdraw. Their presence fades from the foreground of human affairs. Kingship remains, temples rise, agriculture expands, but the direct intimacy between gods and mortals diminishes. It is as if a door quietly closed. Archaeology confirms that southern Mesopotamia experienced profound transformations around the end of the last ice age. Rising sea levels reshaped coastlines. Sediment layers reveal episodes of flooding. Climate instability during the Younger Dryas, approximately 12,900 to 11,700 years ago, disrupted ecosystems across the northern hemisphere. While the Sumerian texts were composed much later, around the 3rd millennium BCE, they may carry mythic recollections of older environmental upheavals. Memory does not always preserve dates. It preserves impressions. Consider the persistent flood traditions across cultures, the Hebrew narrative of Noah, the Greek tale of Deucalion, the Indian account of Manu. Each describes divine warning, deluge, survival, and renewal. Some researchers propose that these shared motifs reflect a common ancestral story, perhaps rooted in post-glacial flooding events such as the inundation of the Persian Gulf basin, which was once a habitable plain before rising seas submerged it. If ancient communities witnessed the slow drowning of lands where their ancestors once lived, how would that memory survive? As geology or as myth? Still, there remains an unsettling detail in the Mesopotamian texts. After the flood, after the rains contract and cities are rebuilt, the narrative does not resume where it left off. It does not restore the earlier intimacy with the Anunnaki. The divine assembly becomes more distant, less immediate. The era of tens of thousands of years is never recovered. One could argue that this reflects a theological evolution, a shift from mythic imagination to bureaucratic state religion. As city-states competed and scribal schools formalized traditions, the gods became institutionalized. But even institutionalization does not fully explain absence. Why preserve the memory of divine descent if the present no longer experiences it? The clay tablets themselves offer subtle clues. Scribal colophons sometimes note that texts were copied from older exemplars. Fragments discovered at sites like Nineveh, in the library of Ashurbanipal, reveal that stories were recopied centuries after their first composition. With each copying, nuances may have shifted. Lines may have been lost. Interpretations layered upon interpretations. Silence can enter a tradition not only through destruction, but through omission. The great library of Alexandria would later burn, though historians debate the extent and timing of its losses. Temples were destroyed in conquests. Languages evolved, cuneiform eventually falling out of use. By the first centuries of the Common Era, few could read the script that once recorded divine counsels. Knowledge, like land, can submerge. Yet when 19th century archaeologists such as Austen Henry Layard unearthed clay tablets from Assyria and Babylon, and when scholars like George Smith deciphered the flood narrative in the Epic of Gilgamesh, there was a collective sense of rediscovery. The flood of Genesis had an older cousin. The biblical text was not alone. If one tradition preserved a fragment of a larger memory, what else might lie behind the fragments? The Anunnaki themselves are described in varying ways, sometimes as offspring of An, the sky god, sometimes associated with the underworld, sometimes simply as powerful deities who determine fate. Modern alternative theories have proposed more dramatic interpretations, suggesting extraterrestrial origins or lost advanced civilizations. Academic consensus does not support such claims, emphasizing instead linguistic, cultural and mythological continuity within Mesopotamia. But even within scholarly frameworks, questions persist. Why does the earliest recorded history begin with a declaration that kingship descended from heaven? Why does it immediately situate humanity in relation to beings who are later described as distant or withdrawn? It is not the presence of gods that intrigues, but their fading. Perhaps the fading represents maturation, humanity stepping out from divine supervision. Perhaps it reflects trauma, encoded as separation, or perhaps it marks the boundary of what could safely be remembered. There are moments in human experience when an event is too overwhelming to articulate directly. It becomes metaphor, it becomes symbol. Over centuries the symbol hardens into tradition, and the original referent dissolves. What remains is ritual, numbers, names. Eridu, the first city in the King List, now lies in ruins. Wind moves across its mounds, the marshes have retreated. No voice rises from its ziggurat, and yet the clay tablets endure, whispering of a time when rulers reigned for impossible spans, and when a flood redrew the world. Was the departure of the Anunnaki a theological abstraction, or the mythic memory of a rupture so profound that history itself restarted afterward? If the earliest texts are already written in the aftermath, then what stood before them, unrecorded? The silence before the first line of cuneiform may be the most eloquent testimony of all. And if something once walked beside humanity, only to leave in haste, then the real question is not whether it existed, but what caused it to depart. The fading of the Anunnaki does not occur with thunder. There is no dramatic proclamation announcing their departure. Instead, the texts grow quieter about them. The divine assembly remains in the background, invoked in hymns and temple dedications, yet no longer portrayed as walking directly among fields and canals. Kings continue to rule, priests continue to chant, the rhythm of irrigation and harvest resumes. But something in the tone has shifted, as though the age of immediate presence has narrowed into ceremony. In the earlier strata of Mesopotamian tradition, Eridu is remembered not merely as a city, but as a place where order itself first crystallized. Archaeology confirms that Eridu is among the oldest known settlements in southern Iraq, its layers stretching back to the 6th millennium BCE. Beneath successive temples built one atop another, there is a sense of continuity, yet also of replacement. Each structure overlays the previous one, as if renewal required burial. The Sumerians believed that civilization was granted, not invented. Kingship descended from heaven. The arts of writing, measuring, building, and judging were bestowed by divine decree. In later myths, these gifts are sometimes called the me, sacred ordinances that structure reality. They are stolen, transferred, guarded. They are not described as gradual human discoveries but as endowments. If such endowments were once believed to flow directly from the Anunnaki, what happens when the flow seems to cease? Some scholars have observed that Mesopotamian literature reflects cycles of divine favour and withdrawal. In the Lamentations over the destruction of Ur, written after the city fell around 2004 BCE, the gods are described as abandoning their temples before catastrophe strikes. The language is intimate and sorrowful. The city is not destroyed because the gods are defeated. It is destroyed because they have already left. This motif repeats across centuries, divine departure preceding disaster. It is less an explosion than an evacuation. Geological research suggests that the Persian Gulf was once a fertile basin during periods of lower sea level. As the last ice age ended and glaciers melted, rising waters gradually flooded the region between roughly 12,000 and 8,000 years ago. Some researchers have proposed that this submerged landscape could have hosted early human settlements. If communities were displaced by encroaching seas, their descendants might preserve stories of the drowned homeland. Yet even if such flooding occurred, why would it be remembered as the withdrawal of divine beings? There is another possibility, quieter, but no less unsettling. The earliest urban civilizations depended on fragile environmental balance. Salinization of soil, shifting river courses, drought cycles, all could destabilize cities. When irrigation canals clogged or rivers changed direction, once thriving centers could decline. To ancient observers, such systemic collapse might feel as though the cosmic order itself had faltered. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, though debated, suggests that a cosmic event may have triggered sudden climate cooling around 12,900 years ago. While mainstream consensus remains cautious, the idea persists in academic discussion. Even without a cometary impact, ice core data and sediment layers confirm abrupt climatic shifts at the end of the Pleistocene. If humanity witnessed skies darkened by dust, seasons disrupted, animal migrations altered, how would that experience be encoded? As atmospheric physics? Or as the agitation of gods? In the Atrahasis epic, the gods send successive calamities because humanity has become too numerous, too loud. The narrative presents catastrophe as a response. Yet between the lines, one senses anxiety. The divine council debates, decisions are reversed, regret enters the story. Regret is a curious attribute for immortals. As cuneiform evolved from pictographs into complex syllabic script, scribes refined not only administrative records, but also theological nuance. The gods became layered personalities. They could err, they could withdraw, they could be appeased. Over centuries, direct divine kingship, rulers claiming literal godhood, gave way to more mediated authority, where kings were chosen by gods but not identical to them. It is tempting to interpret this as socio-political development. As institutions matured, theology adapted. But development does not fully dissolve the haunting sense of rupture embedded in the earliest records. The Sumerian King List, in its stark declaration of a flood dividing eras, reads almost like a memory of reset. Before the flood, reigns stretch beyond comprehension. After, they contract into historical plausibility. It is not gradual, it is abrupt. The transition is framed as an event that redefined time itself. Civilizations often encode trauma as cosmology. The destruction of cities becomes divine judgment. The loss of land becomes sacred myth. Over generations, specificity softens, but emotional resonance persists. And yet, the Anunnaki are not described as perishing. They do not die in these accounts. They step back. Their councils grow distant. Their names remain in prayers, but their immediacy fades. Perhaps this fading reflects the human condition more than any external departure. As societies stabilize, mysteries become doctrines, experiences become stories, stories become rituals. The sense of living at the edge of cosmic intervention gradually transforms into reverence for inherited tradition. But one detail continues to linger. The King List does not attempt to explain why the flood occurred. It states it, almost matter-of-factly. The simplicity is unsettling, as though explanation was unnecessary because memory was still vivid when first inscribed. Later generations copied these tablets without elaborating on the silence before them. They preserved the break but not the cause. They recorded that kingship descended from heaven, but did not describe how it ascended again. It is possible that nothing supernatural lies beneath this pattern, that environmental change, mythic imagination, and scribal tradition alone account for the arc from divine proximity to divine distance. It is possible that the panic later readers sense is projection. And yet, absence can weigh more heavily than presence. When modern archaeologists brush dust from a clay tablet, they reveal words pressed into mud 5,000 years ago. The tablet survived. The reed stylus marks survived. But the world that inspired those marks, the sky they looked upon, the rivers they feared, cannot be reconstructed in full. If the Anunnaki were never more than symbolic personifications of natural forces, then their departure might represent humanity's dawning recognition of autonomy. But if the myths encode deeper disruptions, geological, climatic, or civilizational, then the texts may be the quiet aftermath of upheaval far older than their inkless script suggests. The first lines of recorded history feel like the second chapter of a longer narrative, and if the scribes of Sumer were already writing after something had ended, if their world was already shaped by loss and recalibration, then perhaps the real mystery is not why the Anunnaki left, but what they were leaving behind, and what humanity inherited in the silence that followed. If the silence after the flood marked more than a literary device, then the earliest cities of Mesopotamia were built not only upon mud brick foundations, but upon a psychological horizon already altered. Uruk's massive walls, attributed in later legend to Gilgamesh, rise in the archaeological record during the 4th millennium BCE. Administrative tablets appear, trade networks extend, writing crystallizes from accounting marks into narrative. Civilization does not begin timidly, it surges forward with astonishing coordination. Yet nowhere in this acceleration is there a claim that humanity invented itself. The myth known as Enuma Elish, though compiled in Babylon centuries later, preserves an older structure of cosmic conflict and ordering. The world emerges from divine tension. Chaos is subdued. Marduk fashions humanity from the blood of a defeated deity, assigning humans the labour of maintaining temples and sustaining the gods. The Anunnaki are witnesses to this ordering, participants in it. They are not distant stars. They are structural agents of reality. But in the layers of these texts, one senses hierarchy rearranged. Earlier Sumerian traditions place An, Enlil, Enki and Inanna at the forefront. Later, Babylonian redactions elevate Marduk. Political shifts reshape divine emphasis. Theology adapts to empire. The gods move not only in heaven, but across the map of power. Could the fading of certain divine roles reflect nothing more than dynastic change? Perhaps. Yet when one reads the earliest hymns to Enki, god of wisdom and subterranean waters, there is a tone of intimacy, of guidance offered directly. Enki warns Atrahasis of the coming flood. He whispers through reeds. He intervenes subtly but decisively. After the deluge, the divine council imposes new boundaries, limits to human fertility, mortality reinforced, structures stabilized. It is as though a negotiation has concluded. Why does that negotiation feel final? Archaeologists excavating sites like Shurapak have uncovered flood deposits dating to around 2900 BCE, evidence of a significant local inundation. Such events would have devastated settlements along riverbanks. Yet these were regional floods, not global cataclysms. The mythic flood likely blends multiple experiences across centuries. Human memory compresses. But even if the flood of the text reflects accumulated regional disasters, the symbolic weight it carries remains disproportionate. It divides eras, it truncates lifespans, it reframes kingship. In many ancient cosmologies, time itself is cyclical. The Maya conceived of successive worlds destroyed and renewed. Hindu texts speak of yugas, descending ages of moral and spiritual decline. Hesiod described ages of gold, silver, bronze and iron. Each cycle begins with proximity to the divine and ends with estrangement. The Mesopotamian record does not outline such a formal sequence, yet the pattern is implied. Before the flood, extended reigns, direct divine ordination. After the flood, shortened rule, institutional mediation. Perhaps what is being remembered is not the literal departure of beings, but the contraction of perception. Anthropologists have noted that early agrarian societies experienced profound shifts in worldview compared to hunter-gatherer cultures. Sedentism altered relationship to land and sky. Calendars replaced intuitive seasonal awareness. Temples centralized ritual. As complexity increased, immediacy sometimes diminished. If early communities felt the presence of cosmic forces as direct and animate, later urbanization might have translated that experience into structured theology. The departure could symbolize the transformation of lived spirituality into codified religion. Yet the unease persists. The King List's assertion that kingship descended from heaven implies a transmission event. Something was given. If given, could it be withdrawn? Later Mesopotamian omens and divination texts obsess over signs of divine favour or displeasure. The liver of a sacrificial sheep becomes a map of cosmic intention. Every eclipse, every irregular birth, every storm carries interpretive weight. This intensity suggests vulnerability. Civilizations aware of fragility often encode that awareness into ritual. The annual Akitu festival in Babylon reenacted cosmic renewal, reaffirming order each spring. The king was symbolically humbled before Marduk's statue, stripped of regalia, struck and restored, a ritual dramatizing dependence on divine sanction. If the gods had once been closer, their distance would not merely be theological, it would be existential. Modern scholarship situates the Anunnaki firmly within Mesopotamian cosmology, their roles traceable through linguistic and cultural continuity. The term itself likely derives from An, sky, and Kai, earth, signifying offspring or princely beings of the sky god. They preside over fate. They are numerous, not singular. No credible archaeological evidence supports literal extraterrestrial interpretation. Yet myth does not require literalism to carry encoded memory. Göbekli Tepe, discovered in southeastern Turkey and dated to the 10th millennium BCE, predates Sumer by thousands of years. Massive stone pillars carved with animal relief suggest organized ritual activity long before established agriculture. The site challenges linear narratives of civilizational development. It implies that complex symbolic systems emerged earlier than once assumed. If human societies were capable of monumental construction and shared mythic frameworks deep in prehistory, then the Sumerian texts may indeed be inheritors of older, unrecorded traditions. What we call the beginning might be only the first surviving layer. In this light, the panic sometimes inferred in later interpretations of Anunnaki departure may not signify fear of humanity, but fear of instability. Environmental volatility at the end of the Ice Age reshaped habitats across Eurasia. Rapid warming, meltwater pulses, sea level rise. These processes unfolded over centuries but would have felt dramatic within human lifespans. Communities displaced by encroaching waters might interpret the sky itself as altered. Familiar coastlines vanished, river mouths shifted, ancestral burial grounds submerged. When the world reconfigures, explanations follow, and explanations crystallize into story. Perhaps the Anunnaki did not leave in panic, but humanity encoded catastrophe as withdrawal because absence felt more comprehensible than chaos. If the protective order once believed to structure reality seemed to falter, framing that rupture as divine departure provided narrative coherence. Still, one cannot ignore the emotional timbre in the texts. When cities fall, the lamentations speak of gods who have departed, leaving temples empty. The metaphor is persistent. It is not neutral. It is grief. Grief implies relationship. The earliest scribes did not compose their lines as detached historians. They wrote as inheritors of tradition already marked by loss. The clay tablets begin midstream. Kingship descends from heaven, yet heaven no longer appears visibly active in the same way. If something shifted, whether climate, consciousness, or collective memory, it shifted before writing stabilized. And so, the first recorded chapter of civilization reads like an afterword to an unwritten preface. The Anunnaki remain named, honoured, invoked. But the immediacy of their presence recedes into ceremony and symbol. If departure is not always physical, but perceptual, then perhaps what ended was not their existence, but humanity's ability to experience them as near. And if that ability can diminish, could it also return? There is a peculiar detail that lingers beneath the surface of early Mesopotamian literature, not in what is said, but in how abruptly tone transforms. The world before the flood is described in broad, almost weightless strokes. Time stretches. Kings reign for impossibly long spans. Divine authority appears immediate and unquestioned. Then the narrative tightens. Mortality sharpens. Institutions solidify. It is as though the air itself has grown heavier. If one reads the Sumerian King List slowly, almost meditatively, the cadence shifts after the floodline. Before, the text moves through vast ages with sweeping assurance. After, it becomes granular, tethered to recognizable cities. Kish, Uruk, Ur. The mythical horizon contracts into something administrative. It feels less like legend and more like record. Why does the divine scale diminish so decisively? One possibility rests not in catastrophe, but in cognition. Cultural historians have proposed that human consciousness itself may have evolved in its structure over millennia. Julian Jaynes once suggested that ancient societies experienced internal voices, perceived as gods, in ways fundamentally different from modern introspection. His hypothesis remains controversial and widely debated, yet it points toward an intriguing idea that what is described as divine presence may reflect altered states of human awareness. If early communities experienced their environment as more animate, more saturated with agency, then the departure of gods might correspond to a gradual shift toward internalized reflective consciousness. The Anunnaki would not have vanished physically. They would have receded into symbol as human self-awareness deepened. Yet even if consciousness evolved, that does not fully explain the emotional tone embedded in the myths. The flood is not described as gradual adaptation. It is rupture. The gods are not merely quiet, they deliberate in agitation. In the Atrahasis epic, when the floodwaters rise, even the gods cower like dogs gathered against the walls of heaven. Such imagery suggests fear, not serene transcendence. Fear of what? Climate science confirms that abrupt transitions punctuated the end of the last glacial period. Ice cores extracted from Greenland reveal sudden temperature spikes within decades. Meltwater pulses raise sea levels meters within relatively short spans. For communities living near coasts or river deltas, these changes would not have been abstract data points. They would have been existential upheavals. When sea levels rise steadily across generations, the transformation feels cosmic. Familiar landmarks disappear. The boundary between land and sky shifts. Oral traditions preserve such experiences not as charts, but as narratives of divine displeasure or withdrawal. It is not necessary to imagine advanced beings departing spacecraft. It may be enough to imagine a world destabilized so profoundly that previous cosmologies fractured under strain. Yet another layer complicates the story. As writing emerged in Mesopotamia around 3200 BCE, it began primarily as a tool of administration, tracking grain, livestock, labour. Mythological texts appear later, refined in scribal schools. By the time the great epics were inscribed, they were already products of centuries of oral transmission. Oral memory does not preserve events as linear history. It distills emotion, compresses sequences, elevates archetypes. A long series of floods across centuries can merge into a single, overwhelming deluge. A gradual theological shift can be remembered as divine departure. But still, the language of descent remains. Kingship descended from heaven. The me, the divine decrees, were granted. Civilization was conferred. If something was given, its removal or diminishment would feel catastrophic. The ruins of ancient cities suggest cycles of abandonment. Uruk declined. Akkad vanished from record after its empire fragmented. Ur fell. Each collapse was followed by reorganization. Mesopotamian history is not a straight line, but a pulse, rise, fall, adaptation. And within that pulse, the Anunnaki become less central over time. By the first millennium BCE, their prominence has diminished relative to other deities in evolving pantheons. They are not erased, but their narrative weight shifts. What if the earliest memory of them encoded a relationship that later societies could not sustain? The hypothesis of cyclical civilization resets, though speculative, has gained popular attention. Some propose that advanced cultures may have existed before the end of the Ice Age, erased by natural disasters. Mainstream archaeology remains cautious, emphasizing lack of direct material evidence. Yet discoveries like Göbekli Tepe and submerged structures along ancient coastlines complicate assumptions about the simplicity of early societies. If complex symbolic systems predate agriculture, then mythic memory may reach further back than once believed. Still, caution is necessary. The human tendency to fill silence with grandeur can distort interpretation. Absence of evidence is not evidence of hidden empires. The Anunnaki, within academic study, remain firmly rooted in the cultural and religious evolution of Mesopotamia. Yet there is something haunting about the way the earliest written record begins midstream. No creation account in Sumer speaks of absolute beginning. Instead, there is ordering of what already exists. There is structuring of chaos. It feels less like origin and more like restoration. Perhaps the flood narrative is not about the first destruction, but about the latest in a series. Perhaps the scribes wrote from within a long memory of cycles. Across continents, myths describe golden ages preceding decline. Hesiod's Age of Gold, where humans lived in harmony with gods, gives way to iron and toil. Hindu cosmology describes Satya Yuga, an era of truth, followed by diminishing moral clarity. These traditions are geographically distant yet structurally similar. Is this convergent coincidence, or does it reflect a universal human intuition that something pristine once existed and was lost? In Mesopotamia, that lost proximity takes the form of divine councils and vast reigns. After the flood, humanity inherits a narrowed world. The gods remain in temples, but the sky feels further away. It is tempting to frame this as tragedy, but perhaps it was adaptation. If early cosmologies could not withstand environmental volatility, new structures were necessary. Ritual replaced immediacy. Law replaced instinct. Writing replaced voice. The Anunnaki did not vanish from tablets. They became institutional. And yet, in the quiet between lines, one senses that the scribes were aware of standing at the edge of something older. Their words feel like preservation attempts, like pressing reeds into clay to keep memory from dissolving entirely. If there was panic, it may not have been divine. It may have been human. A recognition that the world had shifted irrevocably, that what once felt stable now trembled. When the first cuneiform signs dried in the sun, they marked not just transactions but transition. The flood had swept over, kingship had descended, the gods had convened. But whatever preceded that opening declaration remained unspoken, and perhaps the truest mystery is not why the Anunnaki left, but why the memory of their closeness survived at all, lingering like an after-image in the earliest chapter of recorded time. There is a quiet unease that settles in when one realizes how much of early Mesopotamian knowledge reaches us through copies of copies. The clay tablets discovered in the ruins of Nineveh, Babylon and Ashur were often written centuries after the events they describe. The library of Ashurbanipal, assembled in the 7th century BCE, preserved texts already ancient to its scribes. Those scribes did not claim authorship. They claimed fidelity. They were transmitters of something older. Transmission, however, is never neutral. When a text is recopied across generations, it absorbs the anxieties and assumptions of each era. Political upheaval, conquest, theological reform, all leave subtle imprints. The Babylonians reshaped Sumerian myths to centre their own patron deity, Marduk. Assyrian kings inserted themselves into narratives of divine favour. Stories evolve as power shifts. If the earliest references to the Anunnaki were shaped by such redactions, what might have been softened, reframed, or omitted entirely? In some Sumerian compositions, the Anunnaki are described as judges of the underworld, seated in solemn assembly. In others, they determine fates at creation. Their role is both cosmic and administrative. They are not depicted as chaotic wanderers. They are structured, hierarchical, procedural. Yet the flood narrative disrupts that composure. The gods deliberate destruction. They unleash it, then they regret it. Afterward they impose new limits on lifespan, fertility and noise. Humanity becomes constrained. Mortality is reinforced. It is difficult not to sense recalibration. The geological record supports the reality of repeated environmental stresses in ancient Mesopotamia. Droughts around 2200 BCE contributed to the collapse of the Akkadian Empire. Shifting river channels forced cities to relocate or decline. The fragility of irrigation-based agriculture meant that small climatic variations could have dramatic consequences. To those living within such instability, divine displeasure would not have seemed metaphorical. The world itself was responsive, sometimes hostile. But there is another dimension to consider: astronomy. Mesopotamian scholars were meticulous observers of the sky. By the 2nd millennium BCE, they recorded planetary movements, eclipses, and omens associated with celestial events. The heavens were not distant abstractions. They were active participants in earthly fate. The very term Anunnaki connects to An, the sky god. If celestial irregularities occurred, unusual comets, eclipses, meteor showers, Their psychological impact could have been profound. Even today, sudden astronomical events can stir unease. In antiquity, such phenomena were often interpreted as signs of divine agitation. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, though contested, proposes that a cometary event may have triggered climatic disruption around 12,900 years ago. Evidence cited includes microspherules and elevated platinum concentrations in sediment layers. Many scientists remain skeptical, emphasizing the need for stronger corroboration. Yet the debate itself illustrates how cosmic and terrestrial narratives intertwine. If ancient ancestors witnessed a dramatic celestial event coinciding with environmental upheaval, that memory might persist as a story of gods disturbed or departing. Still, caution must temper imagination. There is no direct evidence that Sumerian scribes recorded knowledge of prehistoric comet impacts. The chronological gap between the Younger Dryas and the earliest cuneiform writing spans millennia. Oral transmission can preserve motifs, but it also transforms them. Perhaps the departure of the Anunnaki reflects something subtler. The institutionalization of religion. In early temple economies, priests mediated between gods and community, offering sustained divine statues believed to house presence. Ritual calendars structured time. As bureaucracy expanded, divine interaction became procedural rather than spontaneous. The sacred was scheduled. This transformation could feel like withdrawal. When experience becomes ritualized, immediacy recedes. What was once perceived as direct communication becomes formal liturgy. The gods remain, but access narrows, and yet in certain hymns there remains longing. Appeals to deities often plead for return, for renewed favour. The tone is not merely reverent, it is imploring. Longing implies separation. If one strips away speculation and listens only to the emotional cadence of the texts, a pattern emerges. Memory of closeness, rupture through catastrophe, restructuring under new constraints, and enduring hope for restored harmony. Whether interpreted theologically, psychologically, or environmentally, the arc remains consistent. The Sumerian King List, so stark in its division, may symbolize not just floodwaters, but threshold. Before, humanity existed in extended proximity to cosmic order. After, that order required mediation. Lifespan shortened, authority decentralized. The scale of time compressed into something measurable. Perhaps this compression marks the beginning of what we recognize as history. The era when memory no longer floats in mythic vastness, but is anchored to reigns and dates. In that sense, the panic of departure might represent the human confrontation with finitude. When the illusion of endless golden ages dissolved, mortality asserted itself. And yet, there remains a whisper within the clay, a suggestion that the earlier scribes knew they were inheriting fragments. They did not claim to invent their cosmology. They positioned themselves downstream of something grander. Civilization, in their telling, was not born from trial and error alone. It descended. If descent occurred, ascent must also be conceivable. But the texts do not describe ascent. They do not narrate the return of kingship to heaven. They speak of maintenance, of sustaining what remains. The divine assembly becomes distant authority rather than active companion. Perhaps that distance is the defining feature of the human epoch. When modern readers encounter the Anunnaki, interpretations often swing between strict academic restraint and expansive speculative mythology. One side emphasizes linguistic evidence and cultural continuity. The other imagines lost technologies and cosmic migrations. Between these poles lies a quieter possibility, that the myths encode a profound psychological shift, a recognition that humanity now stands alone in a way it did not before. If that recognition felt abrupt, even traumatic, it might have been remembered as abandonment. The earliest lines of written history do not celebrate origin. They acknowledge inheritance. They begin after something has already unfolded. And if the Anunnaki once represented an order so immediate that its absence felt like loss, then perhaps what the scribes truly recorded was not divine panic, but the first moment humanity sensed the weight of autonomy. In the drying clay of their tablets, pressed beneath a Mesopotamian sun, they captured that sensation without naming it directly. They preserved the flood. They preserved the descent. They preserved the memory of closeness. But what preceded the first preserved word, and what precisely ended when the waters rose, remained suspended in the silence before the stylus touched earth. There is a threshold that often goes unnoticed in the study of ancient texts, the moment when myth hardens into memory and memory into structure. In Mesopotamia, this threshold feels particularly fragile. The Anunnaki appear fully formed in the earliest recoverable layers of literature. They do not evolve gradually from primitive animism within the written record. They are already assembled, already hierarchical, already engaged in the governance of fate. This completeness at the beginning is unsettling. Usually one expects cultural development to reveal rough edges, partial concepts that mature over time. But the earlier Sumerian references present a cosmology with coherence. Divine councils convene. Cities are assigned patron deities. The cosmos is partitioned between sky, earth, and underworld. It feels less like invention and more like inheritance. If the scribes inherited their cosmology, from whom did they inherit it? Archaeological strata beneath the Sumerians reveal Ubaid culture, stretching back to the 6th millennium BCE. The Ubaid people built temples, practiced irrigation, and developed symbolic motifs that later civilizations absorbed. Figurines with elongated heads, stylized features, and ritual postures have been discovered at Ubaid sites. Scholars interpret them cautiously, generally as fertility figures or ritual objects. Yet their existence suggests that complex symbolic systems preceded the flowering of urban Sumer. Symbolism rarely emerges overnight, it accumulates. The Anunnaki, as described in later texts, are not creators of humanity in isolation. They are participants in an older order. In some hymns, they are invoked collectively, their authority diffuse but immense. They sit in judgment, determining destinies inscribed on tablets of fate. The concept of fate itself is striking. To inscribe destiny suggests permanence, yet the flood interrupts permanence. Even divine decrees are not immune to upheaval. The gods debate, revise, constrain. One wonders whether the flood narrative marks not simply environmental disaster, but theological reconfiguration. If a prior worldview no longer aligned with lived reality, adaptation would be necessary. The memory of a golden proximity to gods might remain, but practical governance required structure. Structure leaves traces in law codes. The Code of Ur-Nammu, one of the earliest known legal compilations, presents justice as divinely sanctioned yet humanly administered. The king receives authority from the gods, but enforces law through earthly institutions. The divine becomes guarantor rather than actor. This distinction matters. In earlier mythic time, the Anunnaki appear as direct arbiters. In later historical documents, their presence is invoked ceremonially, while human administrators carry out decisions. It is as though a curtain has been drawn. Curtains are not always signs of absence, they are signs of separation. If separation intensified gradually, perhaps there was no singular departure. Perhaps there was accumulation of distance, of reinterpretation, of ritualization. Yet the flood remains a pivot point, narratively disproportionate. Some geologists have explored the possibility that the Black Sea experienced a rapid flooding event around 5600 BCE, when Mediterranean waters breached a natural barrier. The hypothesis, proposed by William Ryan and Walter Pittman, remains debated. Even if accurate, it occurred far from southern Mesopotamia, yet human migration patterns could carry stories across regions. Stories travel further than coastlines. Across Anatolia and the Levant, early Neolithic communities witnessed dramatic ecological transitions. As glaciers retreated, new lands opened, then sometimes submerged. Human groups moved, intermingled, adapted. Oral traditions might encode collective experiences spanning generations, blending distinct events into unified narratives. If the Anunnaki were once associated with particular celestial cycles, perhaps astronomical irregularities intensified the sense of rupture. Precession of the equinoxes, though subtle across a single lifetime, gradually shifts the backdrop of stars against seasons. Ancient sky watchers attentive to such patterns might perceive cosmic drift as meaningful. Whether consciously recognized or not, slow celestial shifts could contribute to mythic frameworks of decline or departure. Yet even as speculation expands, the clay tablets remain stubbornly grounded. They speak in human terms: noise, regret, labour, flood. The gods complain of humanity's clamour. They send plagues. They reconsider. The emotional palette is distinctly anthropomorphic. Perhaps this anthropomorphism is key. By projecting human emotion onto divine figures, ancient authors externalize their own uncertainties. Panic among gods could mirror panic among communities facing drought or invasion. Withdrawal of divine presence could symbolize loss of stability. In times of profound transition, attributing upheaval to higher agency offers coherence. It allows catastrophe to be narratively contained. Still, something in the language resists simple allegory. The descent of kingship from heaven is framed not as metaphor but as foundational fact. Civilization is portrayed as gift. When gift becomes inheritance without visible giver, a subtle tension arises. The tension between origin and continuity shapes the earliest chapters of history. Scribes in Nippur and Uruk were not naive storytellers. They were scholars of their era, trained meticulously in copying, memorizing, and interpreting tradition. Their decision to preserve flood narratives, exaggerated rains, and divine assemblies suggest that these motifs carried significance beyond entertainment. They preserved them because they mattered. If the Anunnaki once embodied the intimate architecture of reality, sky interacting with Earth, then their narrative distancing may reflect humanity's increasing awareness of its own agency. Agriculture, trade, law, and warfare expanded under human direction. The cosmos no longer intervened as visibly in daily governance. Agency can feel like abandonment when first encountered. Imagine a society transitioning from perceiving guidance in every storm and harvest to recognizing patterns governed by impersonal forces. The sky ceases to speak directly. Rain follows climate cycles. Disease follows contagion. Such realizations would not occur instantaneously, but gradually. Gradual realizations, when remembered, often compress into singular events. Thus, the flood becomes symbol for threshold. The Anunnaki's retreat becomes metaphor for maturation. Or perhaps the maturation itself was so disorienting that it felt like loss. What remains undeniable is the structure of the narrative. Immense ages of divine closeness, sudden rupture, contracted time, mediated authority. This pattern recurs across civilizations. It resonates because it reflects something archetypal, the movement from innocence to complexity. If the earliest written record already speaks from within that complexity, then whatever preceded it, whatever sense of immediacy once existed, lies beyond textual reach. The Anunnaki do not vanish from myth. They become memory within memory. They are invoked in rituals long after their centrality fades. They are names preserved in stone, their stories layered beneath successive interpretations, and so the clay tablets do not shout of panic, they whisper of transition. If there was fear, it may have belonged not to gods, but to those who felt the ground of certainty shift beneath them. The world before the flood was remembered as expansive, luminous, prolonged. The world after became finite, structured, accountable. Perhaps the true departure was not divine but perceptual, a narrowing of horizon as humanity stepped into responsibility. Yet even responsibility carries longing. In the quiet spaces between cuneiform lines, in the careful repetition of ancient names, there lingers an undercurrent of remembrance, as though the scribes hoped that by inscribing the descent of kingship from heaven, they might one day glimpse its source again. What stood at that source, and why it receded, remained suspended in the half-light of prehistory, waiting patiently in the silence before the next tablet is turned. There is another layer to the silence, one that rests not in climate, nor in theology, but in power. Every civilization that consolidates authority eventually curates its own memory. Temples decide which hymns endure, empires choose which gods ascend, scribes copy some tablets and allow others to erode. What survives into history is rarely accidental. In Mesopotamia, religious evolution unfolded alongside political ambition. When Babylon rose to prominence, Marduk was elevated above older deities. The Enuma Elish itself, recited during the New Year festival, effectively recentered the cosmos around Babylon's patron god. Earlier Sumerian narratives were not erased entirely, but they were reframed. Reframing can be gentler than erasure, yet equally transformative. If the Anunnaki once occupied a more central position in pre-Sumerian or early Sumerian cosmology, later theological systems may have diluted their prominence without overtly rejecting them. Their authority became background architecture rather than narrative focus. One must consider the psychology of empire. A city-state that rises from obscurity to dominance benefits from a myth of singular legitimacy. It is easier to claim divine mandate if the divine hierarchy is streamlined. Complex councils of ancient beings may not serve centralized ideology. In that sense, the departure of the Anunnaki might reflect political theology rather than cosmic panic. Yet political shifts alone do not account for the pervasive motif of loss woven through Mesopotamian lamentations. When cities fell, Akkad, even mighty Babylon, the texts often speak of gods abandoning temples before destruction. The imagery is hauntingly consistent. Statues carried away, sanctuaries left empty, divine presence withdrawn. The metaphor implies that catastrophe follows absence, not vice versa. This reversal is psychologically significant. It suggests that people believed order collapsed because sacred proximity had already diminished. When a temple stood hollow, vulnerability followed. The fall of the Akkadian Empire around 2200 BCE coincided with severe drought conditions across the Near East. Sediment cores and archaeological surveys confirm widespread agricultural stress. Inscriptions from the period describe famine and societal strain. Later narratives attribute collapse to divine displeasure. From a modern vantage point, climate explains drought. From an ancient perspective, divine withdrawal explains climate. These dual explanations need not conflict. They coexist as layers of interpretation. Still, there remains a deeper unease. The earliest written myths do not celebrate an unbroken golden age. They preserve a fracture at their core. The flood is not merely punitive, it is transformative. After it, humanity is constrained. Mortality is emphasized. Divine human intimacy narrows. Perhaps this narrowing reflects recognition of limits. The Sumerians were among the first to systematize law, mathematics, and astronomical observation. Their sexagesimal system still shapes our measurement of time. Their city planning demonstrates logistical sophistication. Such achievements require analytical thinking, abstraction, and institutional memory. As abstraction grows, myth often adapts. Gods shift from immediate companions to symbolic guarantors of cosmic order. The Anunnaki may represent an earlier conceptual layer, a worldview in which celestial and terrestrial were interwoven intimately. As rational systems expanded, that interweaving might have felt less immediate. But if rationality expanded, why preserve myths of immense reigns and divine councils at all? Because identity requires depth. Civilizations anchor themselves in antiquity to legitimize present structures. The Sumerian King List, with its antediluvian rulers, situates cities within a continuum stretching into mythic time. Even if reign lengths were symbolic, Their magnitude conveys gravitas. Yet the flood's insertion as dividing line ensures that mythic antiquity remains unreachable. It is acknowledged but sealed off. Sealed memories carry tension. Modern archaeological discoveries sometimes reopen such tension. The unearthing of Göbekli Tepe challenged assumptions that complex religious structures required established agriculture. Here were monumental pillars erected by hunter-gatherers. The sequence of causality shifted. If early humans were capable of coordinated symbolic architecture long before urbanization, then perhaps Mesopotamian myths echo deeper pre-agricultural traditions. The Anunnaki could symbolize a pre-literate cosmology inherited through oral transmission. Inheritance without written origin often feels mysterious. The gap between the end of the Ice Age and the rise of Sumer spanned several thousand years, a vast stretch during which human communities adapted, migrated, and reorganized. Writing captures only the final chapter of that transition. Thus, the earliest texts may already be retrospectives, composed by people aware that they stand at the end of a longer arc. There is something poignant in that awareness. When scribes impressed stylus into clay, they did so in schools, guided by tradition. They memorized hymns, copied epics, practiced precision. Their work was meticulous, almost reverent. They preserved the flood story not because it was comforting, but because it defined a boundary. Boundaries protect and isolate simultaneously. If the Anunnaki once represented a cosmic intimacy that no longer felt accessible, preserving their memory maintained continuity with that past. Even as theology evolved, the names endured. Names can outlive understanding. In later periods, as Assyria and Babylon contended for dominance, older Sumerian texts were sometimes archived rather than actively recited. They became heritage rather than living doctrine. The divine assembly receded further into antiquarian memory. Perhaps this gradual distancing is what later generations would reinterpret as departure in panic, a mythologized attempt to explain why the gods no longer intervened visibly. Or perhaps the panic belonged to humanity itself, confronted by forces beyond control: drought, flood, invasion, plague. When patterns break, fear seeks narrative. What remains consistent across millennia is the sense that something foundational shifted before writing began. The King List's stark declaration of flood stands like a hinge in time. Before, immeasurable ages. After, calculable reigns. This hinge invites contemplation. If the earliest preserved texts already speak from after the hinge, then whatever preceded it remains submerged beneath layers of silt and silence. The Anunnaki, whether cosmic beings, archetypal forces, or inherited symbols, anchor that submerged world. They are remembered not as vanquished, but as distant. Distance can arise from evolution, from politics, from environmental change, from shifts in consciousness. It does not require spacecraft or cataclysmic battles in the sky. It requires only transformation profound enough to alter perception. And so the clay tablets endure as quiet witnesses to that transformation. They record descent from heaven and flood that swept over. They preserve lament and law, ritual and recalibration. Yet they never fully explain why the world before feels larger than the world after. If that largeness was once tangible, if it felt real to those who inherited its echo, then the narrowing of horizon would indeed feel like loss. Whether that loss was divine withdrawal, climatic upheaval, political reframing, or maturation of mind remains unresolved. The Anunnaki stand at the edge of that unresolved space, present in name, absent in immediacy, and perhaps it is precisely that unresolved space that continues to draw inquiry across centuries, as though something within the earliest written memory still waits to be understood. There is a subtle distinction between forgetting and sealing away. Forgetting dissolves gradually, like ink in water. Sealing preserves something intact, but inaccessible, placed behind a door that is closed not out of neglect, but intention. When reading the earliest Mesopotamian records, one cannot escape the feeling that certain memories were sealed rather than erased. The floodline in the Sumerian King List is not described with drama, it is almost restrained. Then the flood swept over, no elaboration, no cosmic spectacle, just a hinge. Before, immeasurable reigns. After, humanly scaled dynasties. Such brevity suggests familiarity, as though explanation was unnecessary, because the audience already understood the magnitude implied. That kind of narrative economy often indicates proximity to trauma. When an event is deeply embedded in collective memory, it requires few words. The silence around it carries weight. The flood does not need detail because it functions as boundary. In later centuries, elaborations would appear. The Epic of Gilgamesh expands upon the flood, offering sensory description, storm, darkness, terror. Utnapishtim recounts how the gods unleashed destruction, and later granted him immortality. Yet even here, the emphasis falls not only on survival, but on aftermath. The gods gather like flies around sacrifice, hungry and chastened. Their power feels shaken. If the divine assembly could be shaken, what stability remained? One possibility is that the myth encodes a moment when natural predictability faltered. Agriculture depends on seasonal reliability. If rainfall patterns shifted abruptly, or rivers overflowed beyond expected cycles, confidence in cosmic order would erode. The gods, understood as guarantors of order, would appear unstable. In such circumstances, ritual intensifies. Mesopotamian culture developed elaborate systems of divination, reading the liver of sacrificial animals, interpreting celestial omens, cataloguing portents in extensive omen series like Enuma Anu Enlil. These practices suggest a society keenly attuned to signs, perhaps even anxious for them. When uncertainty rises, interpretation multiplies. Interpretation attempts to regain control. But what if the very need for heightened divination reflects an earlier rupture? If once the divine-human interface felt immediate and intuitive, later reliance on formalized omen systems might signal distance. When presence fades, procedure replaces instinct. The Anunnaki, in earlier hymns, appear as participants in creation and decree. In later omen texts, divine will is inferred indirectly through signs. The shift from dialogue to decipherment may represent theological maturation, or estrangement. Estrangement does not require hostility, it requires separation. There are also hints of cosmological layering in Mesopotamian thought. The heavens were divided into multiple levels. The underworld had structured gates, the earth floated between. This stratified cosmos suggests order but also hierarchy. Movement between layers required permission or catastrophe. When the flood narrative describes waters rising to heaven's walls, it blurs boundaries. The ordered cosmos momentarily collapses into undifferentiated chaos. Restoration follows, but the memory of collapse lingers. Memory can reshape worldview for generations. Perhaps the Anunnaki's perceived withdrawal reflects an attempt to prevent recurrence. After the flood, limits are imposed. Lifespans shorten, fertility is regulated, noise is curbed. The divine assembly appears determined to stabilize a world that had spun too far. In that sense, panic might be a retrospective projection, a human reading of divine urgency. Yet another perspective emerges from comparative mythology. In many traditions, a primordial age of direct divine presence gives way to separation after transgression or overreach. In Genesis, humanity is expelled from Eden. In Greek myth, Prometheus's gift of fire leads to punishment. In Hindu texts, yugas decline in virtue. These narratives share structural resemblance to the Mesopotamian arc. An initial intimacy fractures, replaced by mediated relationship. The recurrence of this pattern across cultures suggests that it may reflect a fundamental human experience, the awareness of limitation. As societies grew more complex, the gap between aspiration and reality widened. Administrative systems could not eliminate drought. Law codes could not prevent invasion. Temples could not guarantee abundance. The gods remained invoked, but their visible intervention diminished. If that diminution was gradual, it may have been remembered as sudden. Modern readers sometimes approach the Anunnaki through lenses coloured by contemporary fascination with lost technologies or extraterrestrial intervention. Such interpretations, while imaginative, often overlook the subtlety of the texts themselves. The power of the Mesopotamian record lies not in spectacle, but in its quiet persistence. Clay tablets endure because they were ordinary objects. Administrative tools, school exercises, temple archives. Myth survived because it was woven into daily life. And yet, the earliest written narratives carry a tone of retrospection. They do not describe an age of gods unfolding in real time. They describe an age already past. This retrospection implies awareness of distance. Distance invites longing. Longing shapes preservation. If the Anunnaki once symbolized a cosmic structure that felt accessible, preserving their names ensured continuity even as experience changed. The temple statues remained, offerings continued, hymns were recited. But the sense of immediacy shifted. Perhaps the shift was subtle enough that no single generation noticed. Perhaps it accumulated across centuries, like sediment building slowly along a riverbank. Only when looking back would the difference appear stark. The flood stands as narrative marker because it compresses that accumulation into event. Whether it represents geological reality, theological recalibration, or psychological transformation, its placement at the threshold of written history is significant. It suggests that writing itself emerged in a world already altered. If the Anunnaki did not depart physically but receded symbolically, the panic later imagined may reflect the human response to standing alone under a sky that no longer spoke in the same way. Standing alone can feel like abandonment or awakening. The earlier scribes did not frame it explicitly as either. They recorded what they inherited. They named the descent of kingship. They marked the flood. They continued the line, and yet beneath their steady hand there remains the impression of something sealed, a memory too expansive to articulate directly, contained instead within structure and number. Perhaps that sealed memory is what continues to resonate. Not the literal departure of beings, but the recognition that at some point humanity crossed a threshold from perceived cosmic intimacy into historical self-awareness. If that crossing felt abrupt, it might have been remembered as divine retreat. And so the clay endures, holding within its baked surface both declaration and silence. The declaration tells of kingship from heaven and waters that swept over. The silence asks what changed in the space between. There is a moment, late at night, when the sky feels impossibly vast and yet entirely indifferent. The stars burn with ancient light, but they do not answer. For the people of Mesopotamia, however, the sky was not indifferent. It was structured, named, alive with intention. Constellations carried stories. Planets were identified with gods. The movements above were read as messages. If the heavens once felt articulate, what would it mean for them to fall silent? Mesopotamian astronomy was not merely observational, it was interpretive. Records from Babylon list eclipses, planetary conjunctions, unusual halos around the moon. Each anomaly was catalogued alongside possible terrestrial consequences. The sky functioned as a script. When Mars lingered in a particular position, it might signal conflict. When Venus vanished unexpectedly, it might foretell instability. Such meticulous attention implies expectation of communication. In earlier mythic layers, the Anunnaki are not distant constellations but actors within the cosmos. Their decisions ripple downward. The boundary between celestial and terrestrial is porous. Over time, that porosity narrows. Celestial events remain significant, but the gods themselves appear less narratively active. One wonders whether increasing knowledge of celestial regularity altered perception. As patterns became predictable, divine mystery might have shifted into mathematical certainty. When eclipses could be anticipated, fear diminished. Awe remained, but panic subsided. Perhaps the perceived departure of the Anunnaki corresponds to the rise of predictability. Predictability stabilizes societies. Agricultural calendars depend on reliable cycles. Administrative systems rely on measurable time. The Sumerians divided the circle into 360 degrees, the hour into 60 minutes. Order became quantifiable, yet quantification does not extinguish myth. It reshapes it. If the cosmos could be measured, perhaps it no longer required constant divine intervention. The gods retreated into abstraction, presiding rather than participating. This retreat might feel like abandonment to those accustomed to immediacy. But there is another possibility, more subtle, more disquieting. What if the memory of divine proximity represents not a literal age of gods, but a psychological state of integration with environment? Early human communities lived within ecosystems they perceived intimately. Rivers were not resources, they were presences. Storms were not meteorological events, they were forces with personality. As urbanization intensified, that intimacy diminished. Cities insulated inhabitants from direct environmental immersion. Walls rose, streets replaced fields, markets replaced migration. The divine-human relationship became mediated through architecture and ritual. Architecture creates distance. The ziggurat, towering above the city, symbolized connection between earth and heaven. Yet its very construction implied separation. A stairway is necessary only when two realms are distinct. In the earlier Sumerian cities, temples dominated skylines. Priests managed offerings. Sacred precincts were demarcated from common space. The sacred was centralized. Centralization concentrates authority and restricts access. If earlier cosmologies allowed for distributed sacred presence, gods in rivers, in winds, in hills, urban religion gathered that presence into institutions. The Anunnaki, once perhaps diffuse, became organized. Organization stabilizes but also limits. This pattern echoes across civilizations. In ancient Egypt, early local deities were later integrated into expansive pantheons under centralized theology. In Greece, Olympian gods gradually eclipsed older chthonic spirits. As societies scale, myth consolidates. Consolidation can feel like loss. Perhaps the Anunnaki did not flee in fear. Perhaps they were absorbed into a new symbolic order. Their multiplicity streamlined, their immediacy codified. Yet even codification preserves echoes of earlier forms. The Sumerian language itself, a linguistic isolate unrelated to Semitic Akkadian, suggests deep cultural roots. When Akkadian replaced Sumerian as spoken language, Sumerian persisted in liturgical and scholarly contexts for centuries. It became sacred script, a language of ritual memory. Sacred languages often preserve archaic cosmologies. If the Anunnaki's earliest conceptualization predates written Sumerian, then by the time it was inscribed, it may already have been fossilized. Fossils are not false, they are remnants, and remnants carry shape without context. There is also the haunting motif of the tablets of destiny, objects upon which fate itself is inscribed. In myth, control of these tablets confers authority over the cosmos. The idea that destiny can be written, stolen, or transferred reflects deep concern with stability. If destiny once seemed fluid, subject to divine debate, perhaps later societies desired fixed structure. Fixity comforts, yet no structure is immune to collapse. Mesopotamian history is punctuated by invasions. Gutians, Elamites, Assyrians, Persians. Each upheaval required reinterpretation of divine favour. When Babylon fell to the Persians under Cyrus the Great, inscriptions framed the conquest as divinely sanctioned restoration rather than defeat. Narrative adjusts to survival. Through these cycles, the Anunnaki remained part of inherited vocabulary, but their narrative centrality diminished. They became ancestors of myth rather than actors of present. Distance accumulates quietly. If one traces the arc from early Sumerian hymns to later imperial inscriptions, one perceives gradual abstraction. The gods are invoked as legitimizing force, yet their personalities soften into titles. The cosmic drama recedes into liturgical formula. Perhaps this abstraction is what later readers interpret as disappearance, and yet the earliest written line, "Kingship descended from heaven," remains defiant. It asserts origin beyond human invention. It insists on vertical transmission. Even if the Anunnaki were always symbolic constructs, their placement at the origin of civilization carries psychological resonance. To believe that order was bestowed is to believe that meaning precedes effort. When that belief wavers, uncertainty grows. If at some point in prehistory communities experienced profound destabilization, whether through climate shifts, migration, or internal transformation, the sense of being guided might have faltered. That faltering, remembered generations later, could be encoded as divine retreat. Retreat need not imply fear, it may imply transition. The clay tablets do not dramatize an exodus, they imply recalibration. After the flood, limits. After the flood, mortality emphasized. After the flood, mediated authority. It is tempting to romanticize the earlier age as luminous and the later as diminished. But perhaps the earlier was fragile, unsustainable in the face of environmental volatility. Perhaps the shift allowed survival. Still, survival often carries nostalgia. In the quiet glow of oil lamps, as scribes pressed stylus into clay, they may have felt both reverence and distance. They recorded names older than their cities. They preserved stories inherited across centuries. They acknowledged a flood that redefined time. They didn't explain why the sky felt further away. Perhaps they didn't need to. For them, the separation was already a fact, absorbed into ritual, embedded in law, woven into identity. The Anunnaki remained as memory of proximity, and in that memory something lingers, not necessarily panic, but a trace of transition so profound that even millennia later, the earliest words of history seem to speak from its shadow. There is something almost paradoxical about the way the earliest civilizations speak of beginnings. They do not begin with innocence, they begin with aftermath. In Mesopotamia, the clay does not tell of a first sunrise, but of a world already ordered, already structured by divine decree, and already fractured by flood. It is this fracture that invites closer listening. When the Sumerian King List declares that kingship descended from heaven, it frames civilization as inheritance, yet inheritance implies prior possession. If something descends, it must have first existed above. If it can descend, it can also withdraw. The language is vertical, but the emotion feels horizontal, spread across time like a memory of distance. By the time writing appears in Uruk around 3200 BCE, urban life is sophisticated. Trade networks extend to Anatolia and the Indus Valley. Standardized weights regulate commerce. Bureaucracy manages grain storage and temple labor. Nothing about this society feels embryonic. It feels established. And yet, its own records gesture backward toward an age more expansive than anything archaeologists can confirm. Perhaps this gesture is mythic exaggeration, or perhaps it encodes the sense that human systems once operated within a broader framework that later narrowed. The narrowing is visible in the shortening of reigns. Before the flood, tens of thousands of years. After, decades. Symbolically, this contraction compresses time. Mythic vastness condenses into historical chronology. Compression changes perspective. When time is vast, existence feels suspended within something larger. When time is measured, mortality sharpens. The flood thus becomes not only environmental rupture but temporal recalibration. It divides immeasurable time from counted years. Some scholars interpret these exaggerated antediluvian reigns as mathematical constructs rooted in the Sumerian base 60 system. Multiples of 60 recur with striking regularity. This may indicate symbolic numerology rather than literal belief. Yet symbolism does not diminish emotional weight. Numbers can encode reverence. The fact that these enormous spans precede catastrophe suggests an age perceived as qualitatively different. Whether or not it reflects literal longevity, it reflects perceived proximity to something transcendent. After the flood, proximity changes. It is tempting to imagine a single event, a comet impact, a massive deluge, a tectonic shift, that shattered an advanced civilization and forced divine departure. Such narratives appeal to modern imagination. But the evidence for such singular catastrophe in Mesopotamian prehistory remains inconclusive. More plausible is cumulative transformation. As the last glacial period ended, human populations expanded into newly habitable territories. Agriculture emerged independently in multiple regions. Sedentary communities formed. Social hierarchies developed. Over centuries, these shifts altered consciousness, economy, and cosmology. Transformation over generations can feel invisible while occurring, yet monumental in retrospect. Perhaps the Anunnaki symbolize the forces guiding humanity through earlier stages. Forces experienced as external because they were not yet conceptualized internally. As societies matured, those forces were integrated into law, ritual, and institutional memory. Integration feels like loss when one recalls an earlier intimacy. Consider the shift from oral to written culture. Oral traditions are fluid, embodied, communal. Writing fixes narrative into form. It preserves, but also freezes. What once lived in voice becomes artifact. The Anunnaki, once perhaps felt as immediate presences in communal storytelling, became fixed names in clay. Fixation creates distance, yet distance allows survival across millennia. There is also the question of why flood myths recur globally. While regional floods are common, the psychological archetype of overwhelming water speaks to primal vulnerability. Water erases boundaries. It returns landscape to formlessness. It dissolves distinctions. After such dissolution, reconstruction requires redefinition. In Mesopotamian myth, reconstruction includes new limitations on humanity. Mortality is emphasized, fertility is regulated, order becomes conditional. Conditional order replaces presumed permanence. If early humans once perceived themselves within an unbroken continuum with the divine, the introduction of limitation would feel like exile. Exile need not involve movement. It can be a shift in perception. The later lamentations over fallen cities often describe gods abandoning temples before invasion. The pattern mirrors the earlier flood. Withdrawal precedes collapse. It suggests that absence of sacred presence destabilizes structure. But perhaps it is the destabilization itself that generates the perception of absence. When drought strikes or armies invade, faith trembles. The gods seem silent. Silence is interpreted as departure. Silence can also be maturation. If the earliest texts are already products of a world wrestling with silence, then the Anunnaki represent memory of voice. The clay tablets do not declare that the gods fled in terror. They do not narrate ships lifting from Earth. Instead, they preserve a hinge in time and a contraction of scale. Perhaps the panic lies not in the gods, but in humanity confronting the limits of its world. As urban centers grew denser, competition intensified. Resource management became complex. Hierarchies solidified. The sense of direct cosmic guidance may have given way to strategic governance. Strategy replaces reliance. Reliance shifts into ritual. Ritual becomes tradition. Tradition becomes history. In this progression, the Anunnaki remain as foundational figures, but their immediacy dissolves. It is striking that the earliest written history begins with assertion of divine descent rather than human innovation. This framing suggests that even as societies achieved remarkable feats, architecture, law, astronomy, they attributed origin beyond themselves. Perhaps this attribution reflects humility, or perhaps it reflects longing for something perceived as withdrawn. The flood marks a threshold beyond which no text ventures backward. It seals prehistory in mythic aura. Everything before is antediluvian, immeasurable. Everything after is recorded. Recording is an act of containment. If the Anunnaki symbolize a pre-recorded age of expansive connection, then writing itself might represent the moment humanity stepped fully into self-definition. Self-definition carries freedom and isolation. The sky no longer speaks directly. It is observed, charted, predicted. The river no longer embodies deity. It is measured, diverted, controlled. Control replaces communion. Yet within every hymn and omen text, there remains a trace of the earlier communion, a yearning encoded in invocation. Perhaps the Anunnaki did not leave in panic. Perhaps humanity crossed a threshold and later remembered that crossing as departure because it felt like loss. The earliest clay tablets stand at that threshold. They look backward toward immeasurable ages and forward toward documented history. They do not explain the space between, and in that unexplained space, between descent from heaven and flood that swept over, the question lingers quietly, as enduring as baked clay beneath desert sun. If one stands at the ruins of Eridu today, there is little to suggest that this mound of earth once held the memory of heaven descending. The wind moves across flattened brick, salt crystals shimmer in the heat. The marshes that once surrounded the city have retreated and returned in cycles, reshaping the horizon. Yet beneath the layers of dust lie foundations of temples built one atop another, each iteration preserving the footprint of the last. This layering is instructive. Civilizations rarely erase their past entirely, they build over it. Foundations remain embedded beneath new walls, memory becomes structural rather than visible. Perhaps the story of the Anunnaki follows the same pattern. Their presence was not demolished, it was absorbed into deeper strata of culture. In the earliest temple complexes at Eridu, archaeologists have uncovered a succession of shrines dating back to the Ubaid period. The continuity suggests sustained ritual focus across centuries. The god Enki, associated with Eridu, was linked to wisdom and subterranean waters, the Apsu, the primordial deep. Water, again, is central. Water nourishes, water destroys. In myth, Enki is both creator and rescuer, warning Atrahasis of the coming flood. His intervention preserves humanity even as other gods deliberate destruction. That tension within the divine assembly hints at division rather than unity. Division implies instability. If the Anunnaki once functioned as a cohesive council, their internal disagreement during catastrophe suggests vulnerability. The flood narrative portrays gods who act, regret, negotiate, and impose new constraints. This complexity humanizes them. Humanization may reflect theological sophistication. As societies mature, their gods acquire layered personalities, but it may also encode experiential truth. That authority itself can falter. Mesopotamian history is marked by repeated cycles of centralization and fragmentation. The Akkadian Empire unified city-states under Sargon, only to collapse amid drought and invasion. Ur's third dynasty restored order briefly, then fell. Babylon rose and fell multiple times. Assyria dominated, then vanished. Each collapse required reinterpretation of divine will. In inscriptions following conquest, rulers often claim that previous kings had angered the gods, prompting withdrawal of protection. The narrative pattern remained consistent. Absence precedes downfall. This repetition reinforces the motif of divine retreat as precursor to instability. Yet one might ask whether this motif served a political function. By attributing collapse to divine displeasure, new rulers justified reforms and reasserted sacred legitimacy. divine withdrawal became explanation and opportunity. If so, the memory of the Anunnaki's distancing may have been amplified intentionally. Still, amplification does not negate origin. The earliest flood narrative predates many imperial reframings. It stands at the beginning of written myth, not the end. Its placement suggests foundational significance. Why begin history with rupture? Perhaps because rupture defined the consciousness of those who first inscribed words. Writing emerges when complexity demands record. It often arises in response to administrative pressure, tracking resources, labour, trade. But narrative writing reflects something deeper. The need to situate identity within time. If the first narratives written down already look backward toward an antediluvian age, then the sense of having crossed a threshold was integral to identity. Thresholds are liminal spaces, neither fully past nor present. They evoke uncertainty. In Mesopotamian cosmology, the boundary between realms required guardians. Gates separated underworld from earth, earth from heaven. Passage was controlled. Perhaps the flood functioned as such a gate. Beyond it lay immeasurable reigns and direct divine engagement. After it lay structured cities and mediated worship. Gates imply restriction. Restriction stabilizes but confines. As societies codified law, standardized measurement, and formalized ritual, they may have perceived this stability as both security and limitation. The earlier age, even if chaotic, might have been remembered as freer. Freedom, when lost, becomes mythologized. In the Sumerian tradition, the concept of me, divine ordinances, includes aspects of culture such as kingship, craftsmanship, music, and even sexual relations. These elements are described as gifts from the gods, transferable and sometimes stolen. The myth of Inanna and Enki recounts how the goddess acquires these decrees from the god of wisdom, bringing them to Uruk. The idea that civilization's components were once fluid, negotiable, suggests a worldview in which structure emerged gradually. Yet once the me are established, they solidify into tradition. Tradition feels stable, but it also marks the end of spontaneity. If early myth remembers a time when divine and human spheres intermingled fluidly, later institutional religion may have formalized that interaction. Formalization can feel like departure. The Anunnaki did not vanish. They were codified. Codification preserves names but alters experience. There is also the dimension of mortality. In the flood narrative, Utnapishtim receives immortality, but humanity as a whole does not. The gods decide that humans must remain mortal. This decision emphasizes separation between divine and human condition. Mortality sharpens awareness. When lifespan contracts symbolically from tens of thousands of years to decades, the psychological shift is profound. Time becomes scarce. Urgency replaces expansiveness. Perhaps the myth encodes this awareness, that the age of perceived immortality ended with the flood. Immortality may not refer to biological fact, but to sense of continuity within an unbroken cosmic framework. After rupture, continuity requires effort. Effort shapes civilization. The earliest scribes, aware of their role in preserving tradition, may have sensed both privilege and distance. They were guardians of memory, yet they wrote in a world no longer described as divine playground. If there was panic, it may have been existential, recognition that humanity now bore responsibility for maintaining order without direct intervention. Responsibility can feel like abandonment, but it can also feel like emergence. The clay tablets do not provide definitive answers. They provide structure around absence. They tell of descent from heaven and flood that swept over. They preserve lament and lore. They maintain names long after immediate presence faded. Perhaps the enduring fascination with the Anunnaki arises not from speculation about extraterrestrial origins, but from this quiet tension embedded in the earliest written record, the sense that history begins after something ended. What ended remains undefined. Was it environmental stability, a mode of consciousness, a political configuration, or simply the illusion that order required no maintenance? The ruins of Eridu stand silent under modern sky. The stars above shine much as they did 5,000 years ago, yet the way they are perceived has shifted. If once they were counsellors, now they are distant suns. And in that shift from presence to observation, one might glimpse the subtle echo of what the flood narrative marks. Not the panic of gods fleeing earth, but the dawning realization that the bridge between heaven and soil had narrowed, leaving humanity to carry memory across the threshold alone. There is an almost imperceptible sadness woven into the earliest hymns, not overt lament, but a quiet recognition that something once nearer now requires invocation. The gods are called upon with careful titles, praised for attributes, petitioned for favour. The tone is reverent, yet beneath it lies effort. Effort implies distance. If the Anunnaki had once been experienced as immediate forces within daily life, the need to summon them formally suggests a shift. In the early dynastic period, city-states were organised around temple complexes. Each city possessed a patron deity whose favour legitimised its rule. Offerings sustained divine statues. Ritual meals were prepared. The gods, embodied in carved images, were treated as living residents. Yet even in this intimacy, mediation existed. Priests performed rituals on behalf of the community. Mediation can begin subtly. At first, perhaps, divine-human interaction felt communal, shared in open spaces. Over time, sacred practice moved inward, behind temple walls. Access became specialized. Authority centralized. Centralization stabilizes belief but narrows experience. It is within this narrowing that one might locate the emotional seed of departure. Consider the gradual shift from polycentric worship to hierarchical pantheons. In early Sumer, multiple gods held regional prominence. Later Babylonian theology elevated Marduk above others, reshaping cosmic narrative. Assyrian tradition emphasized Asher. Divine order adapted to political necessity. In such adaptation, earlier divine assemblies may have lost narrative immediacy. Yet their memory remained embedded in foundational myths. Perhaps the Anunnaki represent a memory of decentralized sacred presence, a time when divine agency was distributed rather than consolidated. As states centralized power, cosmology mirrored governance. Mirrors can distort. The flood narrative, positioned before historical chronology, may symbolize not only environmental rupture but cosmological consolidation. After chaos, order is reasserted under new constraints. Constraints define civilization. When humanity accepted limits on lifespan, on fertility, on autonomy, perhaps it stepped into a new phase of awareness. Awareness brings both clarity and isolation. Isolation can be misremembered as abandonment. Modern perspectives often search for dramatic explanations, celestial collisions, lost technologies, advanced beings departing in fear. Yet the texts themselves speak more softly. They describe debate, regret, recalibration. The panic may lie in the human reading of divine deliberation. In atrahasis, the gods are disturbed by human noise. The metaphor may reflect ecological pressure, overpopulation straining resources. The solution is catastrophic flood. But afterward, measures are introduced to prevent recurrence. This reads less like panic and more like governance. Governance evolves. In the centuries following the flood myth's composition, Mesopotamian society became increasingly stratified. Law codes regulated behavior, trade expanded, diplomacy connected distant regions. Complexity required coordination. Coordination demands structure. Structure reduces unpredictability, but also reduces spontaneity. If earlier communities perceived divine presence in spontaneous natural phenomena, later urban life might have felt comparatively muted. The sky was still observed, but from within city walls. The river still flowed, but through engineered canals. Engineering modifies relationship. The Anunnaki, as cosmic governors, may have symbolized the earlier relationship between humanity and uncontrollable forces. As control increased through technology and organization, those forces felt less personal. Less personal does not mean absent, it means reframed. There is also the element of generational memory. Oral traditions preserve emotional truth even as details blur. A distant ancestral era can be remembered as luminous simply because it predates known hardship. The flood becomes a dividing line between innocence and complexity. Yet innocence is rarely as simple as memory suggests. Archaeological evidence reveals that early societies faced conflict, scarcity, and mortality long before writing. There was no literal golden age free of struggle. The golden age is a symbolic construct, reflecting longing rather than documentation. Still, longing has power. The earlier scribes who wrote of antediluvian kings with immense reigns may have intended to elevate antiquity, to situate their cities within cosmic grandeur. But they also acknowledged rupture. The flood interrupts continuity. Interruption invites interpretation. Perhaps the Anunnaki did not depart in fear of humanity. Perhaps humanity projected its own fear onto divine figures to articulate transition. When the world changes irrevocably, attributing change to divine action offers coherence. But coherence can conceal complexity. The Younger Dryas period, though distant from Sumerian writing, exemplifies how abrupt climate shifts can reshape ecosystems. Hunter-gatherer groups adapted, migrated, innovated. Some scholars speculate that such upheavals may have influenced early mythic structures. Even if indirect, environmental instability leaves psychological traces. Psychological traces accumulate into archetypes. The archetype of lost proximity to the divine appears across civilizations. It may reflect universal developmental patterns, the shift from immediate immersion in nature to reflective self-awareness. Reflective awareness creates separation. Separation fosters narrative. Narrative seeks origin and explanation. The Anunnaki, positioned at origin, become anchors for that explanation. If they once symbolized harmony between heaven and earth, their distancing symbolizes maturation. Painful, yet necessary. Painful maturation can feel like exile. But exile also allows growth. The earliest written texts do not mourn the departure explicitly. They proceed with administration, law, hymn, and epic. Life continues. This continuation suggests resilience rather than despair. Perhaps the true mystery is not why the Anunnaki left, but why humanity remembered them as having been close. Memory persists when it resonates with experience. The sense that something once felt nearer, whether divine presence, environmental integration, or communal cohesion, may echo because it touches enduring human intuition. As cities rose from marshland, as canals redirected rivers, as styluses pressed into clay, humanity stepped further into authorship of its own destiny. Authorship carries responsibility. Responsibility sometimes feels like abandonment of guidance. Yet perhaps the flood marked not divine panic, but the moment humanity began to recognize itself as steward rather than subject. The clay tablets record that recognition obliquely. They preserve divine names, immense ages, catastrophic water, and recalibrated time. They do not declare final answers. Instead, they hold open a question, not about gods fleeing in fear, but about what changes within consciousness when the sky no longer feels immediately responsive. In that question, ancient and modern meet. And perhaps the lingering fascination with the Anunnaki arises not from spectacle, but from this quiet, unresolved space between memory of closeness and experience of distance, a space that still hums beneath the earliest written word. There is a final angle from which the silence can be approached, not as theological shift, not as environmental trauma, but as epistemological boundary. The earliest written texts from Mesopotamia do not simply describe gods and floods. They mark the birth of recorded knowledge itself. Writing creates a line between what can be preserved and what dissolves into prehistory. Everything before the stylus touched clay is filtered through memory. Memory reshapes, condenses, magnifies. The Anunnaki stand at that threshold. They belong to a time just beyond documentation, close enough to be remembered, distant enough to be mythologized. Their narrative placement is neither entirely historical nor entirely symbolic. They occupy the edge of knowable time. Edges often attract projection. As centuries passed and languages shifted from Sumerian to Akkadian to Aramaic, the original phonetic textures of the earliest hymns faded. Even in antiquity, scribes sometimes copied texts whose language they no longer fully spoke in daily life. Sumerian became a learned tongue, preserved in schools long after it ceased to be vernacular. Preservation without full comprehension can subtly alter meaning. What if certain nuances of the earliest Anunnaki traditions were already opaque to later scribes? What if fragments were transmitted faithfully in form but not entirely in context? Loss can occur even when effort is made to prevent it. Consider how modern readers approach these texts. Translation mediates experience. Cuneiform signs are converted into phonetic equivalents, then into English, German, or other languages. Each step introduces interpretation. The flood becomes flood. The descent becomes descended. Yet behind these familiar words lie semantic fields shaped by ancient cosmology. Perhaps the term translated as flood carried connotations beyond water, upheaval, overturning, erasure. Perhaps descended implied more than vertical motion, transmission of order, imposition of pattern. Language narrows when mapped across millennia. The earliest scribes likely understood the Anunnaki within a living symbolic system, rich with ritual and performance. The myth would have been recited in temples accompanied by offerings and communal participation. It was not inert text, it was enacted worldview. When worldview shifts, enacted myth may feel distant. Distance breeds reinterpretation. Modern fascination with the Anunnaki often arises from this very distance. The lack of complete context invites speculation. Where knowledge is partial, imagination fills. Yet even within careful scholarship there remains recognition of incompleteness. Archaeology continues to uncover tablets, but many remain fragmented. Lines are broken. Gaps punctuate narratives. The physical state of the texts mirrors thematic silence. Fragments hint at continuity without fully revealing it. Perhaps the idea that the Anunnaki left in panic reflects modern sensitivity to rupture. We live in an age aware of climate instability, technological acceleration, existential risk. We project our anxieties backward, but projection does not nullify the ancient sense of threshold. The Sumerian King List deliberate separation of antediluvian and post-diluvian eras indicates that its authors perceived history as discontinuous. They did not frame their world as seamless extension of an eternal golden age. They marked a break. Breaks define epochs. When geologists define boundaries between eras, they look for abrupt shifts in sediment or fossil record. In human history, such boundaries are often narrative. The flood in Mesopotamian myth functions like a stratigraphic marker. Below it, mythic vastness. Above it, historical memory. If the Anunnaki belong primarily to the lower layer, their apparent departure may symbolize the sedimentation of consciousness itself. Consciousness evolves not only biologically but culturally. The emergence of literacy alters cognitive patterns. Writing externalizes memory, allowing abstraction independent of immediate context. This externalization changes how reality is conceptualized. Perhaps the flood marks not geological catastrophe, but cognitive revolution, the moment when humanity transitioned from mythic immersion to reflective historiography. If so, the Anunnaki's distancing would not be departure, but transformation from lived presence to recorded archetype. Archetypes endure, but differently. They inform culture without demanding literal belief. They shape narrative patterns and ethical frameworks. Even in later Mesopotamian periods, when political theology shifted, traces of earlier divine assemblies persisted in literature. The Anunnaki did not disappear entirely. They receded into background authority. Background authority shapes worldview quietly. The fact that we still speak their name thousands of years later testifies to their narrative resilience. Perhaps the deeper question is not why they left, but why humanity framed its origins around them at all. To situate civilization as descended from heaven is to root identity beyond immediate survival. It elevates human endeavor into cosmic context. If at some point that context felt less tangible, its memory would acquire poignancy. Poignancy invites mythic elaboration. The notion of panic, of gods fleeing, may be modern dramatization of ancient recalibration. The texts themselves do not describe a hurried exodus. They describe deliberation, destruction, and restructuring. Restructuring suggests continuity. Continuity persists even through rupture. When the flood recedes in the Epic of Gilgamesh, life resumes. Cities are rebuilt, kings reign, worship continues. The world after the flood is not void, it is altered. Alteration defines history. The Anunnaki remain part of that altered world, but in different capacity. Perhaps the real departure was the loss of unquestioned cosmological unity, the realization that order must be maintained through human effort rather than assumed as given. That realization can feel like cosmic silence. Silence can feel like abandonment. Yet silence also invites interpretation, creativity, responsibility. The clay tablets do not close the question. They leave it suspended between myth and record. If the Anunnaki once symbolized the living architecture of reality, their transformation into textual memory marks the moment humanity began to carry that architecture within itself. Whether that moment felt like loss or liberation is left unstated. What remains is the hinge in time, the flood that swept over, the kingship that descended, the immense ages that contracted, and in the quiet space before the first inscribed line, one might sense not panic, but transition, a turning of awareness from sky towards self, from divine immediacy toward historical consciousness. The Anunnaki stand at that turning point, luminous and distant, like constellations whose light still reaches as long after their origin has shifted beyond view. If one lingers long enough with the earliest lines of recorded time, a different possibility begins to take shape, one that neither depends on catastrophe nor on theology alone, but on the fragile architecture of memory itself. Memory is not a vault. It is a living organism. It reshapes what it carries in order to survive. The Anunnaki may represent not a vanished presence, but a memory too large to remain intact. In many early cultures, origin stories functioned as stabilizing anchors. They explained not only how the world began, but why it continued. When these stories shifted, it was rarely because they were disproven. It was because lived experience demanded reinterpretation. Mesopotamia was never static. The Tigris and Euphrates altered their courses over centuries. Cities once central were later bypassed by water. Trade routes shifted. Political alliances fractured. Each generation inherited a slightly different world from the one before. Such incremental change accumulates quietly until it feels abrupt. Perhaps what later readers perceive as the Anunnaki leaving in panic reflects an ancient awareness that the old frameworks could no longer contain emerging realities. The Divine Council, once the guarantor of cosmic coherence, becomes less narratively active as human institutions expand. When institutions expand, authority internalizes. The Code of Hammurabi, inscribed centuries after the earliest Sumerian myths, opens with divine sanction. Shamash, god of justice, grants the king authority. yet the laws themselves are detailed, specific, humanly administered. Divine presence legitimizes, but human governance executes. The gods authorize, humans enforce. This distinction marks maturity. Maturity, however, often carries nostalgia for earlier simplicity. The Sumerian laments for destroyed cities evoke profound sorrow, not merely for physical devastation, but for perceived divine absence. The temple is empty. The god has departed. Without sacred presence, the city feels hollow. Hollowness is psychological as much as physical. It is possible that each collapse, Akkad's drought, Ur's fall, Babylon's conquest, reinforced the narrative that divine proximity had diminished. Over centuries, repeated experiences of loss may have amplified memory of a more intimate past. Amplification transforms recollection into archetype. The flood, positioned before written history, becomes archetype of rupture. The Anunnaki, central before that rupture, embody the world as it once was. But archetypes do not require literal events. They crystallize collective emotion. In evolutionary biology, sudden environmental stress can accelerate adaptation. Species survive by altering behavior, physiology, or migration patterns. Human societies adapt culturally. Myths shift to reflect new circumstances. If early communities once felt cosmically guided and later faced unpredictable instability, their myths would reflect that tension. Tension does not necessarily mean fear of humanity by gods. It may mean fear within humanity itself. There is another, quieter dimension to consider: time perception. In oral cultures, time is often cyclical and expansive. Without written records, chronology blurs into narrative pattern. Writing introduces linearity. Dates, reigns, sequences become fixed. The shortening of reigns after the flood may symbolize this transition from mythic time to measured time. Measured time imposes limits. Limits can feel restrictive. If the Anunnaki belonged to mythic time, to an era when duration was not quantified, their receding into legend may correspond to the emergence of linear historical consciousness. Historical consciousness anchors identity in sequence rather than eternity. This anchoring can feel grounding or isolating. Perhaps the panic embedded in later interpretations reflects anxiety about living within finite chronology rather than boundless myth. The first scribes stood at the edge of this shift. They preserved what they could of inherited cosmology, while constructing systems to manage increasingly complex societies. Complexity demands explanation. Explanation reshapes myth, yet the emotional undertone persists. Something once closer now requires summoning. When temples were active, divine statues were bathed, fed, clothed. The gods were treated as present, but even within this ritual intimacy, the need for repetition suggests maintenance rather than spontaneous encounter. Maintenance replaces immediacy. Immediacy lingers in memory. Perhaps the Anunnaki represent that lingering immediacy, a symbolic embodiment of a time when human beings experienced their environment not as separate, but as saturated with agency. As scientific understanding expands in modern times, similar tensions arise. The more we explain through physics and chemistry, the more some feel a loss of enchantment. The sky becomes vacuum rather than vault of gods, yet awe persists, awe transforms. The Mesopotamian shift may mirror this pattern on a smaller scale. As astronomical observation became more precise, celestial events lost unpredictability. Divine caprice yielded to calculable cycles. Calculation stabilizes but demystifies. Demystification can be misremembered as departure. Still, it is important not to impose modern frameworks too rigidly onto ancient consciousness. The people who composed these texts did not articulate such distinctions explicitly. They spoke in narrative, in hymn, in decree. Their choice to preserve the flood at the threshold of written history suggests deliberate framing. Deliberate framing implies significance. Perhaps the flood is less about water and more about boundary. the boundary between mythic immersion and historical awareness. If so, the Anunnaki's receding prominence signals not their disappearance, but the evolution of human self-perception. Evolution often feels like rupture from within. The clay tablets endure as quiet witnesses to that evolution. They do not shout of divine escape, they whisper of transition. The idea that the Anunnaki left in panic may arise from reading that whisper through modern ears attuned to crisis. Yet within the texts themselves, what emerges is deliberation, regret, recalibration. Recalibration is not flight, it is adjustment. Perhaps what changed was not the gods, but the framework through which they were understood. If that framework once offered expansive mythic unity, and later required structured mediation, the difference would feel profound. Profound differences echo across millennia. When we read those earliest lines, kingship descended from heaven, the flood swept over, we encounter not spectacle, but hinge. On one side of the hinge lies immeasurable time and direct divine narrative. On the other lies recorded history and human governance. The Anunnaki stand at that hinge, luminous against the fading horizon of mythic immediacy. Whether they departed in fear or transformed through reinterpretation remains unresolved. But perhaps the more enduring question is what humanity felt when it stepped through that hinge. When the sky remained vast, the rivers continued to flow, yet the sense of living within a cosmic conversation subtly shifted. In that subtle shift, recorded in clay yet veiled in silence, the earliest chapter of history continues to breathe. There is a final possibility that lingers like mist over ancient marshland. The possibility that the panic was not an event at all, but a sensation carried forward through metaphor. Sensations survive differently than facts. They do not require precision, they require resonance. The earliest Mesopotamian texts do not accuse the Anunnaki of fear. They do not depict frantic escape. What they preserve is tension, deliberation among gods, a flood unleashed, a reordering of human existence. And then, distance. Distance can be experienced as abandonment, but it can also be the natural widening that occurs when a child begins to walk alone. Perhaps humanity's earliest recorded myths encode that first step. In the Atrahasis epic, after the flood subsides, the gods gather to assess what has happened. Enlil is angered that a human survived. Enki defends his action. A compromise is reached. New measures are introduced to regulate human growth and noise. There is no permanent exile from the cosmos, but there is boundary. Boundary defines relationship. Before boundary, perhaps interaction felt unfiltered. After boundary, structure mediates contact. The Sumerian worldview was not naive. It recognized suffering, injustice, unpredictability. Hymns and laments often express confusion at divine decisions. Why have you abandoned your city? Poets ask of gods. The question itself implies expectation of presence. Expectation is shaped by memory. If the Anunnaki symbolize an earlier memory of unmediated connection, then their fading prominence signals adaptation to a world that no longer supported that experience. The archaeological record suggests that early urbanization introduced new stresses. Crowding, sanitation challenges, political rivalry. These were not present in small-scale communities in the same form. Complexity generates anxiety. Anxiety seeks narrative containment. The flood, as archetype, contains anxiety within a single overwhelming event. It explains rupture succinctly. But perhaps the rupture was cumulative. Centuries of environmental shifts, migrations, and socio-political upheavals compressed into a mythic deluge. Compression simplifies. Simplification clarifies identity. The Anunnaki remain at the narrative origin because identity requires anchoring. To say that kingship descended from heaven is to affirm legitimacy beyond circumstance. Yet legitimacy does not guarantee continuity. Over centuries, successive empires claimed divine mandate, each reframed cosmology to suit its rule. the divine council receded further into literary memory. Memory does not disappear. It transforms. By the time later Greek writers encountered Mesopotamian traditions, they filtered them through Hellenistic lenses. Myths migrated across cultures, altering in tone and emphasis. Transformation across cultures often amplifies mystery. The modern imagination, encountering fragmented tablets and partial translations, sometimes reconstructs the Anunnaki as extraterrestrial visitors, bearers of advanced knowledge, departing Earth abruptly. Such narratives reflect contemporary fascination with technology and cosmic possibility. Yet the ancient texts themselves speak more of governance than of machinery, more of fate than of flight. The panic, if it exists, lies between lines, in the contraction of time, in the imposition of limits, in the shift from immeasurable ages to documented reigns. Perhaps the most profound rupture was psychological, the realization that human destiny unfolded within a bounded world. Bounded worlds demand responsibility. Responsibility can feel heavy when first assumed. Imagine a society recognizing that the river will flood according to pattern, not divine whim, that crops depend on irrigation strategy, that laws require enforcement rather than supplication alone. Such recognition does not abolish belief, but it recalibrates it. Recalibration can feel like loss of intimacy, yet intimacy may return in different form, as philosophical reflection, as ethical development, as art and poetry. The earliest cuneiform signs were utilitarian, but soon after, myth, epic, and hymn emerged. Humanity began not only to manage resources, but to question meaning. Questioning marks maturity. The Anunnaki, positioned at the dawn of written memory, embody the threshold between unquestioned immersion and reflective inquiry. If they once symbolized the living architecture of cosmos, their narrative quieting marks the moment that architecture began to be internalized. Internalization changes relationship. The sky remains, but interpretation shifts. Perhaps the flood is less about gods fleeing, and more about humanity crossing from one mode of awareness to another. Such crossings are rarely comfortable. They generate nostalgia for what preceded them. Nostalgia can reshape memory into golden age. The immense rains before the flood may represent not literal chronology, but emotional amplitude, a sense that time once felt expansive, unhurried. After the flood, rains shorten, life becomes measured, mortality presses, measured life intensifies reflection. Reflection produces literature, literature preserves questions. The question of why the Anunnaki appear more vivid before the flood than after may itself be product of reflective consciousness. The recognition that something ineffable shifted. Shift does not necessitate catastrophe. It can be gradual, subtle, pervasive, and yet because it is subtle, myth renders it dramatic. The flood becomes hinge, the Anunnaki become emblem, panic becomes projection. When we read these texts today, we stand at another threshold between ancient cosmology and modern analysis. We bring our own anxieties about climate technology and existential risk. It is easy to see ourselves mirrored in ancient myths. Perhaps that mirroring is the true continuity. The clay tablets endure not because they answer questions, but because they preserve tension. They tell of descent from heaven and flood that swept over. They speak of gods deliberating and humanity adapting. They do not close the narrative. Instead, they leave open a space where memory and interpretation meet, where absence invites inquiry. If the Anunnaki once stood close in story and later receded, perhaps the receding itself is part of the story's purpose. To remind humanity that proximity to meaning cannot be assumed but must be sought. And perhaps the ancient sense of something withdrawn continues to echo because each generation experiences its own thresholds, moments when familiar frameworks falter and new ones emerge. In that echo, the Anunnaki remain, not as fleeing figures in panic, but as silhouettes at the horizon of written time, marking the point where myth gave way to history, and where humanity first recognized the weight of standing beneath a vast, unanswering sky.